If you want to shut down global trade today, you don't need a blockade of warships across the open ocean. You really just need to control the software running a few concrete bottlenecks on the coast.
Exactly. We tend to look at a map of the oceans and see this, vast, boundless free market. But functionally, roughly 80% of global trade by volume is funneled into incredibly narrow, highly controlled physical nodes.
Right, and right now we are witnessing a massive global scramble to build, buy, and control those nodes, driven by both state governments and private equity. Projected global port spending is set to increase by more than a third.
Which is just a huge jump.
It really is. We are looking at a staggering $90 billion being deployed annually by 2035.
And to me, as a financial analyst looking at industry consolidation, it is a phenomenal misallocation of capital. Which brings us to the core tension we are exploring today. Does this politically driven rush to build and duplicate maritime infrastructure serve as a necessary insurance policy that breaks legacy monopolies?
Or does it fundamentally destroy free market efficiency? Like, does it just saddle the global logistics chain with dangerous debt, massive redundancies, and permanently higher prices for consumers?
Exactly. So today's discussion emerges from a deep dive into recent global shipping data, the evolving fragility of maritime choke points, and the increasing friction between state-backed infrastructure projects and private capital.
Right. And I will be arguing that this state-driven and state-incentivized port expansion is a vital security measure. It is a necessary global insurance policy that will ultimately discipline monopolistic pricing, decentralize supply chain risk, and, protect international trade from authoritarian leverage.
And I will argue that abandoning pure commercial logic for the sake of geopolitical point scoring creates a bloated, fractured, and highly vulnerable maritime system. Prioritizing political control over market efficiency forces shipping firms into massive physical asset duplication. It basically creates an environment where taxpayers and investors ultimately absorb the astronomical costs of redundant infrastructure.
Okay, so let me establish exactly why this capital allocation is not just necessary, but deeply strategic. Over the past 5 years, a series of cascading crises, from the pandemic shocks to the rerouting of traffic away from the Strait of Hormuz, has completely exposed the fragility of our current model.
Sure, the shocks were significant.
Very significant, because for decades, we optimized global shipping strictly for cost. We built massive megaships and routed them through a handful of hyper-efficient hubs, but in doing so, we sacrificed resilience.
While we prioritized scale?
We did. But beyond just natural or incidental choke points, we are now facing a directed, state-backed strategy by rival powers to control the physical plumbing of global trade. Chinese state-backed firms now operate or possess a financial stake in at least 129 ports outside China.
Wow. 129?
Yes, at least that many. They have spent at least $80 billion on port construction from Peru to Tanzania, and more than a third of those ports sit adjacent to critical maritime choke points.
And that physical footprint is exactly what is driving the political panic in Western capitals right now. But I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Ports are not software applications that you can just, scale up on a server.
Well, obviously they are physical assets.
Right, they are incredibly capital-intensive physical assets with astronomical fixed costs. The rush to build duplicate ports today is driven almost entirely by political posturing rather than actual commercial demand.
I wouldn't call it posturing.
But it is. When nations begin forcing shipping firms to use specific sea routes or domestic ports to satisfy national security interests rather than economic efficiency, they saddle the entire industry with massive waste.
But those physical assets provide tangible optionality during a crisis. I mean, historically, these major port operators have commanded hefty operating margins averaging more than 40%.
Because they were efficient.
Because they were oligopolies. By financing parallel port infrastructure, we aren't just buying geopolitical insurance, we are breaking up entrenched monopolies, giving shippers better service at lower rates.
They only provide value if they capture sufficient cargo volume to pay off their debt. What we are seeing now is the severe risk of cannibalization. Look at India, which is currently in the midst of a vast, multi-billion-dollar port-building effort, expected to continue until 2047.
Which they need for their own exports.
Sure, India wants its own domestic transshipment hubs, but the country is already bracketed by major, highly efficient, established ports in Singapore to the east and Salalah in Oman to the west. By building out massive redundant capacity, India's new ports risk starving each other of the volume needed to survive.
Right, but you're looking at this strictly through the lens of peacetime efficiency. That completely ignores the mechanics of how supply chains collapse under stress.
I don't think it ignores it. It just weighs the costs.
But what you are identifying as duplicative inefficiency during calm waters is exactly what provides resilience during a disruption. Right now, because of the mass rerouting of shipping networks away from the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz, we are seeing legacy ports left incredibly prone to congestion.
Yeah, the bottlenecks are very real.
Exactly. Container ships in the Indian subcontinent and parts of the Mediterranean are facing massive bottlenecks. When a megaship has to sit at anchor for a week waiting for a berth, shippers are hit with punitive demurrage fees.
Right, fees just for their cargo sitting idle?
Yes, and that delay trickles down the supply chain and leads to sharp spikes in global freight rates. Having another port nearby, even if it operates at a lower capacity during peacetime, gives that shipping line an alternative. It acts as a pressure release valve.
That sounds perfectly logical until you look at the mechanics of maintaining that physical redundancy. Let's move away from abstract ideas of insurance and look at the actual operations.
Okay, let's look at them.
But building redundant ports is like building two massive hyperscale data centers right next to each other to serve the exact same small town. Building the second one doesn't generate more internet traffic. It just bankrupts whoever has to keep the servers cooled, the power running, and the hardware updated.
But maritime traffic isn't static like a small town's internet usage.
But the maintenance is uniquely punishing. We aren't just talking about pouring concrete once and walking away. To keep these duplicative networks operational for these modern megaships, operators have to reinvest in incredibly costly continuous services, like port dredging.
Right, because the draft on these new container vessels is so deep.
Exactly. These modern ships require a draft of up to 16 meters. Rivers and coastlines naturally deposit silt. If you don't run specialized dredging ships continuously, the silt builds up, and a 200,000-ton megaship literally scrapes the bottom and gets stuck.
Sure, dredging is an expensive reality.
Dredging is a massive, permanent fixed cost. If you split the cargo volume between two competing ports, neither port generates enough revenue to easily cover their baseline dredging and upkeep. So what happens? The operators inevitably pass those fixed costs on to the consumers.
See, that argument relies on the assumption that the single network system was actually a free market to begin with. The geographic choke points you're defending are rapidly becoming political choke points. We're talking about market dynamics in the presence of heavy, opaque state intervention.
State intervention is precisely what I am criticizing, regardless of whether it's coming from the East or the West. Look at how government meddling actively disrupts the flow of trade.
Can you give a specific example?
Take the Panama Canal, historically one of the most vital neutral nodes in global shipping. Today, it handles about 40% of America's cargo, which is roughly equivalent to $270 billion of trade annually.
Right, it's highly strategic.
Now, the Hong Kong conglomerate CK Hutchison legally won the rights to operate two major terminals there. But starting around 2016, intense political pressure from the United States was applied behind the scenes to strip them of those rights based purely on geopolitical paranoia.
I wouldn't call it paranoia when a foreign geopolitical rival controls the very levers that allow 40% of your domestic goods to reach your shores. That pressure was a necessary correction.
But look at the sheer market distortion that correction caused. A massive $23 billion deal was eventually orchestrated to bring in the American investment firm BlackRock and the Mediterranean shipping company, MSC, to essentially take over Hutchinson's operations.
Which secured the node.
Temporarily, maybe. The Panamanian authorities literally handed temporary operation to MSC after their top court abruptly ruled Hutchinson's original contracts unconstitutional. And what was the immediate market reaction?
Well, obviously there was pushback.
China retaliated by actively detaining dozens of Panama-flagged ships in their own ports and ordered MSC to cease certain operations. C.K. Hutchinson is now suing Panama for billions. The long-term management of one of the world's most critical maritime nodes is now bogged down in legal and diplomatic chaos.
But the distortion didn't start with the United States intervening in Panama. The distortion is structural to how these state-backed firms operate terminals globally.
How so?
We cannot treat a foreign state-owned enterprise as if it is just a neutral commercial actor maximizing profit. We have hard empirical evidence on how this plays out. Research from the Merix think tank in Berlin recently found something pretty alarming.
About export volumes?
Yes. They found that when countries allow Chinese firms to run all their terminals at a given port, those host countries experience a massive 19% drop in exports to the rest of the world.
A 19% drop sounds shocking, I admit. But port operators are inherently incentivized by volume and throughput. Making less money just doesn't make sense.
It makes sense if profit isn't your primary motive.
Unless you're suggesting they are deliberately weaponizing their terminal operating software to throttle local competitors.
That is exactly what the data suggests is happening, and it's crucial to understand the mechanism of how they do it. Operating a modern port isn't just about lifting boxes. It's a highly algorithmic process.
Right, it's all scheduled digitally.
Yes. These state-backed terminal operators control the software that dictates berth allocation, the scheduling of the ship-to-shore cranes, and the queuing of the trucking gates. They can strategically optimize the logistics for their own domestic fleets or favored clients.
And introduce subtle delays for others?
Exactly. They subtly introduce algorithmic delays for competing export vessels. A 10-minute delay per container might seem invisible on paper, but multiplied across a massive vessel, it destroys a local exporter's profit margins and delivery windows. It is an invisible structural market distortion.
Which is incredibly difficult to prove definitively. You are talking about black box algorithms.
But the risk alone is why interventions by Western regulatory bodies are required. The U.S. Federal Maritime Commission, for example, has explicitly stated they are deeply scrutinizing anti-competitive behavior in new megaports like Chancay in Peru.
Which is majority owned by a Chinese state firm.
Exactly. The FMC has serious regulatory teeth, including the ability to levy crushing sanctions and tariffs on carriers. Deploying those tariffs isn't disrupting the free market. It is actively preventing an authoritarian power from utilizing subtle algorithmic delays to achieve total supply chain dominance.
I understand the fear of algorithmic manipulation, I really do. But the solution being proposed, this narrative of a private-led Western response, is largely an illusion.
Why is it an illusion?
Because you are championing this idea that Western intervention and private equity are somehow securing independent infrastructure. But what does a bifurcated ocean actually look like in practice? It means a global shipping company might eventually have to maintain two entirely separate fleets.
Well, a diversification of fleets, yes.
It's more than that. They have to run two separate logistics software systems and navigate entirely different regulatory frameworks just to trade in different hemispheres. It completely destroys the core economies of scale.
But the capital markets disagree with your assessment of the risk. The response isn't just government mandates. It is heavily driven by private capital seeking a return. Since 2021, non-Chinese shipping companies have announced roughly $140 billion in acquisitions.
Right, there's a lot of money moving around.
A massive amount. We are seeing huge influxes of private equity changing the leverage at these ports. In January, the American investment firm Stonepeak formed a $10 billion joint venture called United Ports with the shipping giant CMA CGM.
Sure, APM terminals and Eurogate are pouring money in too.
Over $1 billion into expanding North Sea terminals. Yes. This influx of capital proves that the market sees immense value in building robust, decentralized infrastructure. Private equity doesn't invest $10 billion out of political charity. They see a profitable path to independence.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Yes, they are buying the physical real estate and the administrative rights, but let's look at the actual mechanics of what operates that real estate.
The equipment, you mean?
Exactly. A listener looking at their local port might wonder why it matters who manufactured the cranes if the port is sitting securely on American or European soil. It matters because the hardware and the digital nervous system are utterly compromised.
I think compromise is a strong word.
It's the accurate word. Even at these newly acquired private Western ports, Chinese state-backed firms are deeply, inextricably embedded in the daily operations. Shanghai Zhenhua Heavy Industries manufactures more than 70% of the world's ship-to-shore cranes.
Yes, they have a huge market share.
They are massive, 200-foot-tall, highly automated machines that actually lift the cargo. They are laced with advanced sensors and diagnostic software that communicate back to the manufacturer. Furthermore, Chinese companies manufacture roughly 95% of the literal shipping containers used globally.
Hardware supply chains can be diversified over time. The immediate imperative is securing the geographic nodes so we have a place to put new hardware.
But it is not just the metal boxes and the physical cranes. It is the data architecture coordinating them. Consider Logic, a Chinese government-run logistics management platform, right, which is highly scrutinized.
As it should be. It is currently utilized in at least 24 countries and operates across dozens of major global ports. It shares critical data with CargoSmart, another software firm owned by the Chinese state firm Costco.
Creating a very integrated ecosystem.
A dangerous one.
Together, this integrated digital ecosystem gives a single foreign government access to the exact manifests, whereabouts, and routing of up to 90% of the world's container ships. So I have to ask,
Go ahead.
how exactly does Stonepeak or any Western private equity firm achieve national security when the literal physical hardware lifting their cargo and the data systems managing their newly acquired ports remain inherently tethered to the very state they are trying to insure against?
Because that assumes the current hardware and software landscape is a permanent, unchangeable absolute, which it isn't. Yes, there is a dominant market share in ship-to-shore cranes and logistics platforms right now. But Western governments have already recognized this specific vulnerability.
Recognizing it and fixing it are two different things.
But action is being taken. This is exactly why the United States officially banned the use of Logic in 2023 across military and strategic commercial ports. The $140 billion of private capital flowing into port acquisitions is merely step one.
And step two?
Step two is systematically ripping and replacing the compromised digital infrastructure and heavily incentivizing the domestic manufacturing of maritime hardware. It is a sequenced strategy. If we don't buy and control the physical concrete ports first, we have nowhere to install our own secure cranes and software down the line.
But the timeline for replacing 70% of the world's massive port infrastructure is measured in decades, not years. You cannot just swap out a fleet of automated ship-to-shore cranes over a weekend. It requires years of procurement and specialized engineering.
It's a long-term play, absolutely.
But in the meantime, by forcing global shipping to aggressively bifurcate its supply chains, you are asking the industry to abandon the very efficiency that made the modern globalized economy possible. When every major economic bloc demands its own secure end-to-end logistics hub, you end up with profound overcapacity.
Overcapacity can also mean abundance and lower prices.
Now with these fixed costs, we're talking about billions of dollars sunk into redundant berths and dredging operations that will struggle to maintain profitability. That financial strain doesn't just disappear. It gets loaded onto the balance sheets of the shipping lines, which inevitably means higher prices on the shelves for everyday consumers.
While the alternative is far worse. The alternative is continuing to rely on a hyper-efficient, single point of failure system that can be turned off like a light switch during a geopolitical crisis or a pandemic.
I don't think it's as simple as a light switch.
It effectively is. I will readily admit that transitioning away from that system is going to be messy, and the capital expenditure is undoubtedly going to be expensive. But moving past the era of monopolistic legacy ports is a net positive for the global economy.
Even with the massive debt?
Yes. Historically, shipping companies had absolutely no leverage against ports charging exorbitant fees with those 40% profit margins. Now, as these new state-backed and private equity-funded ports come online, legacy operators will actually have to compete for cargo volume.
Assuming the new ports survive.
They will, because these ongoing investments act as vital geopolitical insurance. They serve to decentralize global trade, lower the historical profit margins of legacy port monopolies, and ultimately protect the maritime supply chain from natural choke points like the devastating Panama Canal droughts and political choke points like the contested waters of the Middle East.
And I maintain that intentionally abandoning commercial logic creates a deeply fractured and inherently inefficient global system. There is a fundamental economic reason the market consolidated the way it did over the last 40 years.
Right, because efficiency absolutely demands scale.
Exactly. By intentionally forcing the duplication of massive physical infrastructure, we are introducing structural inefficiencies that cannot simply be engineered or regulated away.
Even with private equity discipline.
Even with that, the combination of astronomical fixed costs, debt-laden port operations fighting over the exact same cargo volumes, and the aggressive political weaponization of sea routes will ultimately harm our long-term economic independence much more than it secures it.
I see.
We are effectively trading a system of economic efficiency for a system of political paranoia, and the true cost of that trade-off will be paid by everyday consumers who will face permanently elevated prices for essential goods.
Agree on the long-term economic viability of this specific infrastructure boom. I think we both clearly acknowledge that the very nature of maritime trade has shifted entirely.
Definitely.
Global shipping has irrevocably moved from being a purely commercial, cost-optimizing enterprise to functioning as a primary, highly contested battleground of global geopolitics. The mechanics of how goods move across the oceans have fundamentally changed.
I completely agree with that assessment. The era of the open sea serving as a neutral, frictionless highway for global commerce is definitively over. It is now a highly strategic domain where physical and digital infrastructure is the ultimate weapon.
Which brings us back to our starting point. The vast, open blue spaces of our oceans will always funnel into those narrow, controlled, concrete bottlenecks. And whoever controls the concrete, the cranes, and the code ultimately controls the physical flow of the modern world.
Absolutely. We encourage our listeners to dive deeper into the source material, particularly to explore the profound mechanisms of how digital logistics software and automated hardware monopolies are reshaping international trade.
There is certainly a massive amount of complexity beneath the surface of this issue to explore.
Thank you for joining us for this rigorous exchange of ideas. Until next time.
Thanks for being with us. See you on our next video. Let's speak up.